Okay. Thank you all for coming. My name's Tom Wright. I work in the digital transformation team here at Friends of the Earth. Like last month when I did this talk, I've got a whole list of things, housekeeping. So bear with me. I'm going to look at a note quite a lot and make sure I say the right things. I wanted to say welcome and thank you for coming, especially to people who have come up from outside of Friends of the Earth. I know there's a lot of you in the building, and I think there's a few joining us by Skype as well. I hope you have a good hour and you get a lot out of this session. The other thing I need to say is that we're recording this session, so let me know if that's a problem afterwards, and I'll make sure I cut your voice out. But we're going to turn it into a YouTube video and share it in the ether, so people beyond today can make use of it as well. We're going to spend the next sort of hour, just under an hour, talking about Slack. We've titled it, Can We Get Rid of Internal Email? Because we thought we might provoke a bit of a discussion, which is what we want. And I'm really grateful. We're joined by Julius Honor, who's sat next to me, who's the co-chair of the Digital Charities Group and also a digital consultant who runs his own consultancy called Contentious. So he's going to give us a bit of the how we use Slack and why we use Slack, and then potentially if we've got time, we'll do a little bit of talking about how we're using it, particularly at Friends of the Earth. Internally, it started very much as a bottom-up thing. We had a project that was looking at digital organizing, how we could produce better digital organizing tools for our grassroots activist network. And the team that ran that project wanted to look at different ways to do things. One was to reduce the amount of email that was flying around rather than just having an email alias. And the other was to have a look at a potential tool that we could actually use with the activists out there on the ground. So as a project team, they've used it quite well. It has been used by other teams and other individuals in the organizations to varying levels of success. And after Julius has done his talk and presentation, we're going to outline a little bit of the next steps of what's going to happen at Friends of the Earth. John Richardson, who's sitting over there, is going to do a little bit about that, and we can take some questions and discussions around that, but I'm particularly interested in the why we should use Slack today. I think I've finished the end of my list, which is good. So I'm going to hand over to you, Julius.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. Maybe just before I get started, it'd be really good to get a bit of a gauge of how many of you are actually Slack users already. Hands up if you use Slack already. Okay, all right.
Can I just chip in? If you're on link, just do a yes or something in the chat box, and we'll have a good sense from you.
So that looks like a kind of, a slightly more than 50% of you kind of use Slack. So as Thomas said, I think my bit of this is really about why I think Slack works, why I think Slack is a good thing. And as you'll see from the presentation, that's less to do with the functionality and the kind of how you use it, and why I think it's a really good tool, and why it's quite a fundamental change to the way that people work. Do you want to go on to this next slide? So this is some stats about Slack's use. When the first time I did this kind of thing was when I used to Bond. I was the digital manager at Bond, which is the umbrella organization for international development charities. And we were really early adopters of Slack, I think when it was still in beta. And trying to convince people at that point, it was kind of, there's this little startup and it's made this really nice tool. Now it's kind of not really like that anymore. They have 4 million active daily users. Their income is $100 million a year. There are 6 million apps installed. It's a big thing. There's rumors that fly around fairly regularly about Microsoft and various people trying to buy them for $4 billion. There was some rumor a few weeks ago about someone offering $8 billion for them. So it's a big thing, and clearly it's being used by lots of people, which is in itself quite an interesting phenomenon, because this area of sort of the replacement to email has been talked about for a very long time, and no one's remotely been able to crack it until now, which is not to say that Slack solves everything, all the problems about internal email, but clearly they're onto something. I'll try and go through some of the reasons as to why I think they are so successful. This one I threw in this slide just in case there were people who'd never actually seen Slack and didn't know what it looked like. As I say, we can save the kind of how to use Slack bit for the end if you've got any questions about how to do specific things, then maybe we can have a chat about that at the end. But yeah, this is Slack. This is digital charities in Slack, in fact, which again I'll talk about a little bit later as to how we use that as a bit more of a kind of community platform in digital charities. So the first section, I've broken this down into 4 sections as to why I think Slack is a good thing. This first section I started off calling usability, and then I decided that usability sounded really dull, and called it likability, and then I changed it to lovability, because I think actually there's something about Slack which is, people get really enthusiastic about it. I mean, I'm quite enthusiastic about it, and it's really hard to imagine people being similarly enthusiastic about Outlook or any kind of the competing options. Slack manages to do something to make people enjoy using it, and I think that for me is one of the most interesting things about it. And as what we do at Contentious is kind of, we call it content strategy, but I think Slack embodies a lot of that, which is a kind of a really effective marriage of functionality and design and content to make it into a tool that people actually enjoy using. And when I was thinking about this presentation, I remembered a conversation that I overheard in a hi-fi shop when the iPod first came out. And the guy in the hi-fi shop was trying to persuade this customer that really they didn't want an iPod, because this hi-fi shop didn't sell iPods because they were a bit snooty about them. And they said, really, the sound quality is not as good as this thing that you could buy. And actually, the functionality is better in this thing as well. And you get far more for your money, and you get more storage. Really, you'd be much better off buying this, whatever it was, and not an iPod. The customer just kept coming back and saying, yeah, but actually, I want an iPod. That's actually the thing that I want, is an iPod. And there's something about that which is not... It's not about what it does. It's not about the functionality. It's about the fact that people enjoy using it, which I think is really fundamental to Slack's success. So, and that, as I say, is not just, it's got a nice design. It is usable, and yes, its functionality is good. It's kind of I'll go on to a bit more about that later. But there's something about Slack's brand, maybe, for want of a better word, which I think is really fundamental to why it works so well. This is a really nice illustration, I think, from their blog, as a post which I'll link to at the end. In fact, I meant to say at the beginning, this presentation I posted on Twitter, if any of you, because there's a few links in here that will be difficult to scribble down. So if you look at my Twitter account, which is @JuliusHonor, there's a link to a PDF of this if you want to follow any of the links. So this is a blog post by someone called Anna Pickard, who was a Guardian journalist and is now director of content. I think maybe her job title is at Slack. She's basically the kind of editorial director. She's in charge of all their content. And content to Slack is something much more than blog posts. It kind of runs through everything they do, and it's very much at the core of why people like using Slack. If you look at the way they do their notes for their updates, if you look at them in the App Store for their iOS updates, if you look at the way that they tweet, if you look at the way that they write about themselves, if you look at everything about them, has got this very strong sense of who they are. They've got a very strong sense of a kind of Slack voice, which I think is really key. And this, to me, is a really interesting thing, because it's not just about how you sell a tool, but actually it's got a lot of lessons, I think, for us as organisations and charities as to what brand can mean. Right? And I could go off on this for quite a long time, and it would probably not be the reason that you all came here to listen to this talk. But there's something about the way that they do brand, which I think is brilliant, because it's not just about their design, it's not just about the kind of look and feel of the tool. It's about Slack feeling like it's a kind of friendly, accessible place to hang out. And the next slide, Tom, I think has got just a few things from their style guide, which I love. And again, there's a link a bit further on in here if you want to read more about their style guide, because I think, this is just really good as to how they've managed to create a tool which is pitched at just the right level, which people describe it often as a fun tool, but I think that doesn't really explain why it works so well. What they've managed to do is they've managed to create something that works as a kind of a workplace tool, but that's also enjoyable, right? And there's some interesting discussion going on at the moment because Microsoft have now launched a kind of Slack competitor called Teams, Microsoft Teams, and it does kind of none of these things. And in typical Microsoft fashion, it has massive amounts of functionality, and it joins up with all the rest of Office and allows you to create Word documents and so on. But I think it misses this crucial thing, which is actually how do you make a tool which is just an enjoyable place to hang out. So that's the bit about why people enjoy using Slack. The second thing that I think is vital to its success is the fact that they've managed to work out a fairly fundamental paradigm shift from email to something else. Now, this is quite typical in a way for digital tools, right? It's quite a well-trodden route that when people create a digital tool, they base it on something which exists in the analog world. So, email is the very name of it is mail, right? The icon that everyone uses is the envelope. It's basically an electronic letter, right? That was the way it was envisaged to start with. It's a way of communicating which is fairly slow. You send a message to someone, you wait for their response, they send you a message back. And that's all very well up to a point, but in a kind of contemporary workplace situation, it's not exactly agile, and it kind of feels like its time has come. The email is also, especially in a kind of internal work environment, email is broken, and it's kind of been broken for quite a long time. The reason why it's carried on, why it still exists, is that it's so ubiquitous. So everyone has an email address, right? You can't navigate the internet without an email address. Everyone has to have one. It's their kind of single point of identity. But it's also rubbish on many levels. So as I've said, it's kind of a bit slow. You send a message to someone, they check their email, they send you a message back. It doesn't necessarily arrive because it has to go through various different servers. It's got all this kind of cultural baggage attached to it, which is just really hard to escape from. You have to start off with dear so-and-so. You have to end with all the best. If you just send a single line email to people, they treat you like you're being rude. It's not very much like having a workplace conversation. It's also really rubbish at many-to-many conversations. If you've got lots of people trying to have conversations with each other, email is you just end up, and I'm sure you all know this stuff, right? You have multiple kind of endless threads of emails where you get copied in halfway through, and it's really hard to work out where the conversation started and where it's gone and who's talking to who, and it's the good thing about it is that it's there and everyone has it, but there's not a whole lot else in a kind of workplace situation that makes it a great tool. And yeah, you end up with inboxes with thousands of unread emails if you're anything like me. Whereas Slack have done something really clever in that they've based their tool. They haven't just looked at the inadequacies of email. They've kind of based their tool on a paradigm of how the workplace could and even should be, right? So they push things about transparency. They push things about people sharing things with each other, which it feels like Microsoft is still stuck in a kind of old world, siloed version of what the workplace is like, whereas Slack have kind of, there are values about what a modern workplace environment could be like, which they're trying to cement in the way that they've built their tool. And there are lots of great things about it. It's adaptable, it's kind of straightforward, it doesn't have a big learning curve, it's not hard for people to work out how to use it, and it just ends up being a little bit more like face-to-face communication, which is not to say that it will take place of face-to-face communication. You know, it's still really important, obviously, for people to actually talk to each other. But the reality is that in a world where lots of people are working from home, where people work in different countries and different time zones, and in big offices where it's not always that straightforward to go and talk to 3 different people or arrange a time when everyone's free and on a certain point in the day, Slack does all that stuff and is a bit more like actual human conversation. Third reason why I think Slack is good is the personalization and the integration into other tools. So although it manages to keep being, at least at the surface level, at the user level, very simple and straightforward, it has complexity and it has kind of possibilities for people to use it in a more powerful way, which are largely hidden underneath the surface. It also, at the same time, manages to stay being personal. And this again goes back to the stuff I was talking about at the beginning, which is about the kind of the feel of Slack, right? So Slack has done a lot to popularize emoji. And to be honest, before Slack came along, I wasn't a huge fan of emoji. And they generally kind of weren't found in the workplace, right? They were something you got in chat apps that you used with your friends, but they weren't generally something that you used with your colleagues. Slack's managed to turn that around and come up with all sorts of really useful ways that people can use emoji, but also kind of put them in as a way in which workplace communication can be friendlier. So, and this is a really nice quote again from Anna Pickard, who, as you can probably tell, is a bit of a hero of mine. Use emoji, but only as frosting, never as food, which I think sums up exactly that kind of balance where they've given the user all sorts of really nice ways that you can use emoji, but they don't replace words because words are still pretty vital. And you can use them. You can use them as ways to vote on things. You can use them for feedback on things. Laura and I at Contentious, we have a reading channel in Slack which pulls in various things that automatically and manually that we've read that we think are interesting, and then we use emoji to kind of say, yeah, I've read this. Yeah, this was really good. Yeah, I've tweeted about this. So there's ways that you can use them functionally as well, which is really useful. The other aspect of this is bots. And again, Slack have done a really good job of turning the idea of a bot from something that was kind of either it was Microsoft's, what was he called, Clippy, which everyone hated and was just really annoying, or it was the idea of a bot was something kind of really techy that other people outside of a kind of narrow tech world were slightly scared of. Slack's managed to kind of give them create bots that have personality that people actually enjoy interacting with, and therefore given the ability for organizations to create new ways of interacting, which some of which are really powerful, but still feel like they're fun, like they're enjoyable. I think the next one, has some examples of some integrations, and I won't go into all of these. There's quite a lot there. The first one is the sort of Google, Dropbox, YouTube, all the things that you would sort of expect to be there as integrations with any one of these kind of tools. But again, Slack does it really nicely. So with YouTube, for example, all you have to do is drop a URL to a video into Slack, and it will automatically pull the video in and allow you to play it right there. If you put a URL, a link to a website, it will automatically bring you in a preview of the website. The Google Docs integration is really nice. You can create a doc from Slack as well as pull in the doc now. So just all these things that just make it much nicer than just sharing a link. But there's a couple of ones here that I'll pull out as examples as well. So Meekan is a really clever one and really useful for teams. And basically, he's or she. I think Meekan is gender non-specific. Will ask you invite him to a channel or her to a channel. She will then ask everyone who's in that channel to give her permission to check their calendars. And then when you want to set up a meeting, you literally just type, Meekan, when's a good time for us to meet next week? Meekan goes away, looks in all your calendars, comes back and says, like, these 3 slots, you're all free. There's one Tuesday afternoon, one Thursday morning, one Friday afternoon. Which do you prefer? Everyone gets to vote 1, 2, or 3. Meekan then says, right, you're all agreed on this one, and adds the thing into your calendar. It's kind of like Doodle, but on steroids. And it's a really nice example of how to do something that people otherwise find a bit of a faff in a really nice, simple, user-friendly kind of way. And yeah, there are others there which, if you're interested, I can go into maybe at the end. But yeah, there's kind of increasingly there are bots to do just about anything that you would want to do. The fourth one is, I think, a particularly interesting one in the charity space. And as Tom was saying at the beginning, I co-chair Digital Charities, which I know some of you are members of. If you're not, you should join up. It's a really good space. And we had a Google Plus community, which we used up until the end of last year. And we also had an email list. And we have monthly face-to-face meetings. And until we started using Slack, the kind of online, even though this is a community of people who work in digital, I think you could say, Neil, my co-chair, is here as well. I think we could say it wasn't the greatest, most successful element of Digital Charities, the kind of online community engagement. People were reluctant to share things, whereas when we moved on to Slack, the engagement levels have massively gone up. And it's now, as well as being a really nice real-world community, it's a fairly active online community of kind of 400-ish people. And partly that's to do with the low barriers to engagement. It creates really nice, kind of easy-to-search archives. It's got a not-for-profit free scheme, which is free up to 250 active users. And again, if you're kind of interested in setting this up as a community, I can go into a bit more of the kind of technical stuff about the advantages and disadvantages of doing that. Yeah, join up to Digital Charities. There's a form on our website that you can use to sign up. And yeah, that's another example of a really nice bot. So there's bots that will create you an online form, and you never leave Slack in order to do it. You just talk to the bot. You say, "Can I have a form, please?" The bot asks you what fields you want in it. You go back and forth a few times. The bot then gives you a link to your form, and then when people use the form, those inputs come back into Slack. So it's just a really nice circular way of creating something that otherwise would be a faff in a really Slack user-friendly way. There's a link there. Hamsterpad.com is a directory of the various different open communities that already exist on Slack. And yeah, there are lots, and if you're interested in finding out more about Slack, it's quite a good thing to join a few of those if you're not already a member, and kind of see how other people use it. Because that's the other great thing about it as a community platform, and I guess for you guys as well as a kind of potential internal email killer at Friends of the Earth, is that it's very flexible and you can use it in lots of different ways. So as a quick and easy way of setting up a community, I'd say it was great. And there are, even if you want to set one up, there are obviously, without getting too kind of meta about it, there are communities for people building communities on Slack, which have got lots of good advice in them as well. I think that might be just about it. Oh yes, further reading. There's you might want to download the presentation for these if you want to read anything more about them. Quite a lot of these are things that Slack have written themselves. The only Microsoft could make Teams is a really interesting one, which was a few days ago by someone who I think is not a Slack employee, but is talking about the difference in approaches between Microsoft and Slack, which is a really good read. Words Are Hard is the one I was talking about earlier on about Slack's style guide, which I think is a brilliant example of how to do a style guide and how to make sure that you have a consistent voice across an organization. How Slack use emoji is a good one. But yeah, there's some good extra reading there should you be interested. I think that's about it for the presentation. But has anyone got any questions?
Thank you, Julius. John, do you want to say a little bit about, was that a question, or do you want to say a little bit? Fire away with a question. I'll bring you the mic. Hold
on. In your experiences, do you have any charities or organisations that have particularly picked it up and have run with it and had quite huge successes that you could talk about?
Huge successes. I think the biggest successes that I'm aware of at the moment are more the communities than the charities, to be honest. I think quite a lot of charities are in that situation, probably not dissimilar to you guys, where it gets adopted by some people because they see that it's a really good tool, but it doesn't necessarily get adopted by the whole organization. And I think that's a challenge for all sorts of different organizations. I don't know if charities are far enough down that road for there to be great examples of success necessarily in terms of a whole organization taking it on. And maybe that says more about charities than it says about Slack. I think it would be fairly easy to find examples of non-charities who've done that. And I know people like WordPress, for example, who are an interesting one because they're a huge, great decentralized organization who have an open source tool and are kind of behind open source in lots of ways, because that's one of the downsides of Slack is that it's not open source, it's a proprietary system. It's kind of it's owned by someone who's making a whole lot of money out of it. But you would think that WordPress would want to go down the kind of open source route, but they've now switched from using their old tool to using Slack. And I think there are lots of examples of startups generally use it. I think charities are probably, lots of them are having a harder time to move away from their old systems because there's a lot embedded in email, right? It's not just a cultural change, it's also an IT leadership, innovation, transformation challenge. Yeah.
Because people who are joining remotely can't hear. And if you could just say who you are, that'd be great.
So hi, I'm Neil from Forum for the Future. I wanted to add to that. I think quite live at the moment. I think there probably are a lot of charities, and I know Forum is one of them, who genuinely are getting quite a lot of short-term immediate success. I don't think any of us, me included, have got to the point of writing it up as a case study. Should have written a blog or something by now already, but my lot love it, absolutely love it. We've got 4 offices around the world. We don't do a great job of communicating between us. there's a load of things, and particularly that sort of enjoyment fun bit, that actively mean that you're talking to your colleagues more about work and getting better work done because of it. And I think I wouldn't be at all surprised if quite a lot of charities, maybe the smaller ones to start with because perhaps it's slightly easier, or the systems are so clunky that you're desperate for something that's a bit better, so you're sort of more inclined to adopt it earlier. I wouldn't underestimate that there would be quite a few who might be in that situation who really can see it, the potential of it already, and are saying, yeah, and they just haven't written the case study up yet, perhaps. But.
Do you want to come back on that one, or are you?
No, only really to kind of maybe ask in the room whether other people are, because I know there's quite a few external people here, whether there's anyone else who is in the process of trying to adopt it, and what kind of, how far down that road people are and what the hurdles are. Is there anyone else who's in that situation?
You are? Okay. So folks on Link, I've got your questions. I'll come to you. Don't worry.
I'm Bobby. I'm from Restless Development. I guess the thing that I want to inquire about is, other than the sort of instant messaging functionality, what sets it apart from some of the competitors? Because we as a charity are all signed up to Google and Google Docs and Gmail, so we use Hangouts quite a lot. So we get the benefit of the sort of eliminating emails and having chats in groups and increasing dialogue with our colleagues through that. So I'd want to know, like, what is different about Slack from something like Google Hangouts, that I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but the instant messaging functionality that would mean that we should shift away from that and try to get people to adopt Slack.
Yeah, obviously there are a lot of people who, instant messaging has been pushed as the solution for a long time by a lot of different people, right? Who've been aware that there are all sorts of serious issues with email, and that actually instant messaging probably is a better solution, especially for kind of internal organizational use. I think one of the reasons why Slack is a better solution than, say, Google Hangouts is the fact that the way that it works as a hub for so many other things. It's the way that it integrates with so many other tools and allows it to be used as the kind of the place where work happens. Right? I think that's kind of their tagline, is like where work happens. And the number of different tools you can integrate with it are, it's almost limitless, and you don't get that with other instant messaging tools. You don't get that if you're using Hangouts. There's things that you don't have to have a bot. You can just have notifications sent through from other tools. So, for example, at Bond, we had it integrated with Stripe so that it pulled in details every time anyone made a payment on the website, which was not useful for the finance people because they had their own systems, but it was really useful for people who kind of needed to keep an eye on that stuff but didn't necessarily want to be going and logging into another system. It pulled in stuff from various web development tools so that, again, you could keep an eye on what the developers were up to, what the designers were up to. We had integrations with project management software, and some of these things, if you're actually a kind of frequent user of the project management tool, maybe you're better off hanging out in the project management tool than you are in Slack. But there's a whole another level, and that's the kind of the transparency thing as well. There's a whole openness to the way that Slack integrates with these tools, which means that you can say, right, I'm gonna pull in every time one of the developers posts something, posts a bit of code to the code base, I'm going to pull in a notification into Slack. Probably that's not that useful for the developers themselves, but it means that anyone else in the organization who has access to that channel can kind of keep an eye on what's going on. If they want to find out about something, they can, because it's there and it's all in one place. So I think that way that it acts as a hub for an organization is one of the reasons why it works so well.
Folks on Link, I am coming to you. I'm going to take one more question from the room.
Hiya, my name's Sarah. I'm not working at the moment, but the last 6 years I've worked for two big NGOs based in London in digital teams, and neither of them were using Slack or were considering it. It all sounds great to me, so what are the disadvantages?
Okay, the disadvantages. The disadvantages are, as I touched on a little bit before, it's not an open source system, right? So there's always the possibility that it gets bought up by someone and they decide to change it into something else. I think that the chances of that are fairly slim, given that it now has so many millions of users. The chances of someone buying it and saying, right, we're going to actually retire it and turn it into Skype or whatever are fairly slim. I guess what are the other downsides of it? Some people argue that the kind of, because it's an instant messenger, basically, that it means that people talk to each other less. The kind of that it cuts face-to-face communication. I would argue actually the opposite, because I think if you share more things, then actually you're much more likely to go and talk to your colleagues. If you know what your colleagues are up to, then actually that increases the likelihood of you going and having conversations with them rather than decreases it. But that's a matter of opinion. Some people think it might do the opposite. I don't know. What are the Neil? Yeah. I suppose that's the big one, in a way, for people who. Now, I'm a geek, basically. I enjoy using new tools, right? I like going and finding out about new tools and experimenting with them. But lots of people are not. Lots of people don't want to have to kind of learn a new thing, and they think, well, email kind of works okay for me. Yeah, it's a bit annoying sometimes, but I know how it works, and everyone has it, and why not stick with what you have? Having to learn another thing, and then also having the possible, and that's the downside of transformation angle of it, I think, is that while an organization is using Slack but also using internal email, you then end up having to duplicate things, at least while you're in that kind of transition, right? You were saying this earlier, Tom, about, I've had to post details about this meeting in 3 or 4 different channels.
Four different channels. There you go.
And that's possibly, to me, I think that's a leadership challenge, maybe, and it's about the way that people, the point at which you say, we can see that this is a really good thing, that we should be adopting this. That's probably the point for someone to stand up and say, right, guys, actually, you're not allowed to use internal email anymore. There may be some teething trouble, but we're going to kind of jump in 2 feet into this particular pool and work out how to use it. But there may be some pain in that transition, I guess.
I think you can say there will be some pain, not maybe some pain. Simon Bowens, you've got a question for us? Sorry it's taken us a while to get to you, but fire away.
No, thanks, Tom. One of the big things that we face as an organisation is the challenge of communicating effectively with our activists outside of the Printworks and in local communities and in our local group network. I wonder whether Slack has the opportunity to improve that, and whether you've got any experience of communities of organisations working with a dispersed activist base using Slack or other tools.
Okay, I don't have the answer to that, but I'm going to look at John and Ian, and which one of you wants to answer that in terms of the digital organising project? Yep.
Hi, Simon. That's quite a good question at this time. So in the last week or so, the digital organising team have just channel for people who are using our digital organising tool called Action Network. And we've just sent invites to those people as single channel users to join a channel on Slack and then talk to us about how they're finding using the tools, what campaigns have they got coming up, what kind of experiences have they had a different tool, whether it's good or bad, and we're starting to try and work out whether we can have really good and meaningful conversations with them about topics, and then kind of mix our internal team and staff with activists on the ground as well. So we're kind of trying that with a channel in Slack with a digital organising project. But yes, that is possible. You can have people outside your organisation as single channel users or multi-channel guests. Yeah, and that's something we're trying internally, but I don't know if Julius wants to talk more about it.
Yeah, I don't particularly have experience of it in that activist space, but certainly in a workspace, when we used it at Bond, that was one of the most successful ways in which it was used when it was pulling in external users as well. So we used it for a couple of campaigns that we were running with member organizations, particularly to kind of coordinate social media and to coordinate communications actions, and then also to give accounts to external freelancers, editors, developers, designers, and so on. And for that stuff, it worked really well.
Sorry, I'm furiously typing away. Phil Burrows, you're next. Sorry, it's taken a while.
No worries, no worries. Can you hear me?
Speak up a little bit, but we've just about got you.
Okay, sorry. I'm feeling pretty sick, so. I just wanted to ask, so, I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of Slack. I've been trying to use it as part of the community organizing team, and I just find it really, really cumbersome. Partly because just the way that the team works and the fact that we have so many strands of different conversations that are always going on, and the fact that we're working on so many different projects simultaneously, that it just feels like when we try to talk about it on Slack, in order to kind of keep track of where the conversation is, it makes it very hard to segment off conversations and figure out when one conversation ended and another conversation started. And I guess I'm just asking, is that because we're not using Slack correctly, or is that just one of the downsides of Slack? Because, I mean, for me, keeping everything sorted in email is pretty darn easy, and I don't have a problem with it. So I don't quite see the benefits of changing over to Slack for that reason.
Okay, that's a really good question. I'm interested to see how you must have a really good email system if you can do all that stuff in email, and it doesn't seem like a problem in email. That sounds like a nightmare in email to me. But I think you're absolutely right that it is one of the challenges of Slack, and probably of any of those tools, is when you've got a lot of conversations going on, is how you organize those conversations. Slack's own advice is that you keep things in as few channels as possible until they become kind of overwhelming, and then you move them into a channel of their own, or you can have a private conversation between a group of people, and you can move things into there. But yeah, I think it is a challenge when you have a lot of different concurrent conversations going on as to how you manage those conversations. But maybe that's a challenge whatever tool you're using. I think the advantages of using Slack for that rather than, say, email is that you can have multiple people chipping into conversations, and you can have engagement in conversations on multiple different levels in a way that's really difficult with email. I mean, in my experience, in kind of especially in internal work conversations, I always find that I get copied into all sorts of long email threads, which I'm only kind of tangentially connected to or relevant to. And in order to kind of work out which bit of that thread you're supposed to be reading and responding to is quite difficult in email. Whereas in Slack, you can have notifications and you can name check people at the point where they need to be pulled into that conversation. It's really easy to search for stuff. You can have particular alerts for particular words, or there are nice ways of setting it up so that you don't have to be one of the key people in the conversation to still kind of be aware of that conversation and to work out what's going on in that conversation. I don't know. Does that answer your question? What is it particularly that you find cumbersome about that?
I think for me it has a lot to do with the wading through all of the conversations. So if it's in an email, I can look at it, I can skim through it, and I can be like, okay, this applies to me, or it doesn't apply to me, and then I can do with it what I need to do, and it's gone. I don't need to worry about it, or I do need to worry about it, one of the two, and I can action it. But in Slack, when I'm looking, I just have to scroll down and just scroll through all of the conversations to find out just even different topics of conversations are often all in the same area. So it's just not segmented out so that each conversation is isolated, and so I can figure out what to do with that conversation. Do I need to leave it? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and maybe I should have a look at your conversations, or maybe I shouldn't. I mean, maybe you're having too many conversations.
Yeah, we have a lot of conversations.
Yeah, I don't know whether this is a problem with the tool or a problem with human conversation. But I think there are ways of segmenting things in Slack, and as I say, there are ways of setting up quite clever notifications for things. And yeah, maybe that would be an area to look at.
Cool. And we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left, folks. I'm aware of 2 questions. Ian, was that directly related, or was it just a question? Okay. I'm also conscious there's a lot of men talking in the room and not a lot of women talking in the room. So, ladies, if you have a question, please ask one.
Hello. So, Activism Team, Friends of the Earth. So just 2 things on that, which really strike a chord with me. One is Slack doesn't have threads, which I think is probably the thing you're struggling with. So you can't, where you might have one email chain that is one single thread. I think both Julius and Phil are looking at it from a completely different point of view. Like Julius gets copied in at the end of a long thread and finds it difficult to climb through it because he's having to read all the information. I think Phil is finding it useful to be able to separate out to have the separation between different types of conversation. But that's partially because, if I'm right, Phil, you're talking about something you do with your team rather than as a project. Where certainly for us at the moment, the most successful stuff I've seen on Slack has been where you're having conversations in a single channel as a project, because the types of conversations you're having are much more clear, and they're more kind of single thread, whereas as a team it's much more complicated because your team is probably working on 100 different things at the same time, and following the thread of that conversation is much more difficult. So I think it works better for projects than it does for teams at the moment, depending on what you want to get out of it. Like if you want to work through it, as opposed to just kind of socialize through it, I think projects work better than teams. But the other thing is that I hadn't appreciated until we had used it for a couple of months, how much etiquette had formed a part of using Slack successfully, and how much that had also formed a part of using email successfully. So don't really think about it, but you already have email etiquette. You already know that hopefully you're trying not to CC too many people, and you're probably trying to find the time at which you can stop CCing the person in, but you're not quite sure exactly when that is. But you do have some mental etiquette for it. You also are probably trying to make sure that your subject line is properly relevant. You're probably also making sure that you're not sending 10 different replies. You're not breaking up each particular sentence into a different email or something. You have an etiquette within email which is super obvious to you because you've been using it all these years, and Slack you have to develop some of that. So things like, there's no point in putting a thank you message where you can just react with an emoji, because that doesn't give someone an extra notification. You have to, if you want someone to see something, you have to mention their name, otherwise they don't have to look at it. And for me, the shift from separating out things that I have to look at, things that I could look at, has been a really big shift in my etiquette and my mental model of how the communication works. But that's kind of a ramble. I don't know if it's...
Okay, I'm going to say one more question from the room, and it's going to be here, and then I'll come to you. Promise.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Laura. I'm from Restless Development. Could you tell us a bit about the success of having it applied internationally? We have offices across 10 countries, and how long do you think it would take to apply this all at the same time across all of those country offices?
Wow, yeah. No, I guess is the short answer to that. I don't really have direct experience of people using it internationally in different country offices. But yeah, I'm sure there are lots of good examples out there of big, international organisations, probably charities as well, using it. But yeah, it's a challenge at another level of complexity, I guess. I think there's one Slack team that I'm on, which is a very international one. Well, there's two actually which are quite international. One of them does then have a channel for each individual country within the team, so that you can have conversations which are international in the kind of general channels, and then you can have national conversations as well within the country channels. I'm not sure how brilliantly that works, to be honest, because I think you end up missing out on stuff that's happening in a country channel, which is probably relevant to a wider range of people. But yeah, I think these are all really interesting challenges that people will come across as Slack grows and it gets adopted by bigger and bigger organizations. And yeah, the problem of how you have these systems at that kind of scale, I don't have any direct experience of, I'm afraid.
Folks, I'm going to try and squeeze in two more questions. So it's taking a while.
Hi, I'm Guy from Global Justice Now. I'm kind of persuaded to go with Slack, mostly through your description of the bots and the meeting stuff. The Meekan thing sounds fantastic. Two questions really. Firstly, how best to persuade perhaps the older members of our organisation that it's a really good idea to make that change? And secondly, is there a model for the transition from email to Slack? Because we kind of had a half-assed attempt through one team trying to test it, and the minute we had to talk to someone else from another team, it all fell flat. Obviously, is it a cold turkey type of transition you would recommend, or how best to go about that?
Sorry, Louise in our Luton office was saying something similar on the sort of message chat, and I was going to come to ask her the last question, but it's a similar thing. So she was asking, like, does it only work if you make it mandatory? Can you weave that in as well?
I think there are two different schools of thought on this. I think, yeah, either you go cold turkey and you say, right, this is what we're using from now on, or you have the slightly more organic approach where you have some people using it and you slowly spread through the organization use by kind of encouraging use and making people feel like they're missing out if they're not there. I think if it was me, I would probably tend towards the first one, because I think it's a change management challenge, I think, really, and it's probably the same as all sorts of types of change management, that it's quite hard. And if you take the more organic approach, there will probably always inevitably be some people who never quite want to make that shift of their own volition. And yeah, how you encourage people who don't want to change that they should change, that's a whole that's a topic of a whole different conversation. I think you can have a campaign, start an internal campaign, and speak to some campaigners about how they would encourage people to change. I mean, I think technically, in some ways, because email doesn't tend to, it has a whole lot of knowledge in it, email, right? But it's almost impossible to get it out. Usually you start in a new job and you get given the keys to your predecessor's inbox because it's got, 3 years of knowledge and communication in it. But it's, in my experience, almost impossible to get any of that knowledge out in a useful way. You kind of spend hours searching through, trying to find the bit of information you need. So it's not, in some ways, it's not a knowledge transformation challenge. It's not about, it's much more about culture. It's much more about changing people's mindsets. But yeah, that doesn't necessarily make it easier. In some ways, it makes it harder. Sorry if that's not a simple answer.
We do. We've got one final point. Neil, I'll bring you in 1 second, and then I'll wrap.
So I wouldn't actually agree, at least in Forum's experience, that the former is better than the latter. I thought about it, and we thought about cold turkey. The biggest convincer, and the reason I now know that we will use this as a major organisational tool rather than just a thing on the side, is because my IT manager found out about it, and I told him we had 45 active users out of like 60 staff. And that was the convincer for him, that people were already using it, so he was going to have to adopt it, he was going to have to get used to it. If I just said, we're going to use this thing because I think it's better than the other thing, it would have taken me a year and he wouldn't have still been convinced afterwards. But because everyone was already using it and he could see it was just a management challenge for him now that he needed to take it on board, that was what convinced it for him. And that means I've got the IT director without even really trying, because he said, well, it's a thing now, so we're going to use it.
Yeah, so it's almost a combination of the two approaches at that point, right? You've got some users, some early adopters, some champions, and you're using them as a good example of how things could be better. But then you're also getting buy-in from leadership who are saying, yeah, look, this is a good thing, we should all be using this.
Sounds like we're in that position at Friends of the Earth, but I think that's a conversation we'll have to figure out ourselves. Certainly it's being used by quite a lot of people. Folks, we're at 1:30, so I wanted to wrap us up. I wanted to thank you all for coming, but first of all I wanted to thank Julius for coming and giving up his time and talking to us. I'm going to do a quick round of applause. Thank you. Never clap with a microphone in your hand, that won't work. For those of you who are on the ECF list or the Digital Charities Group, I'm going to turn this into a YouTube video and I'll circulate that. So if you want to pass it on to people who couldn't make it today, please do so. For those of you who've joined us from outside of Friends of the Earth, thanks for coming. I hope it sparks off some useful conversations where you're at. And if you, if you manage to pursue Slack and make it work, we'd be really keen to hear from you as well. Share learning, share knowledge. And we'll try and do the same from our end. Thank you very much for coming. Okay.